Thanks so much, Anne. And hi, everybody. It is indeed an exciting day. I always say when these collaborative projects are just wonderful. So as Anna said, I will be the program director today just to kind of keep us on track and to guide the process. So I will say welcome, friends, colleagues, and our presenters, because we certainly are a co-created group of various different thinkers, but all with one goal in mind, and that really is to uplift education, both as supervisors, as well as students and participants, facilitators, etc. So I was really excited to be invited to be the program director for this day, because it is our Master Supervisor and Examiner Development Program today. So first up, we're going to have Prof Sean Gossel, who I'll introduce you to now, who will be looking at the MBA, MBL versus MCom supervision, the differences between these qualifications. So what can you expect from a student? What are the differences in terms of research training, as well as the differences in scope and the research reports versus a dissertation or thesis at master's level. So I always say that if you want to present someone to present something, you've got to say, what are they, in terms of what is their knowledge around a certain topic. And when I first got to understand Prof Gossel's CV, I sort of thought to myself, well, this is the perfect person, because he has not only authored or co-authored 20 various journal articles, supervised multiple doctoral and master's students, but he actually serves as a reviewer on over 30 international peer-reviewed journals and on the editorial board of 2 internationals. And that certainly is your fodder for seeing the different types and ways of research. So Prof Gossel joins us. He's the research director at the University of Cape Town. And today he's really going to expand our minds around master's supervision and around, in particular, as I've said, the MBA, MBL versus MCom. So Prof, welcome to you. Thank you for giving of your time and of yourself this morning. Prof Gossel will take us to about close to 4 o'clock, and then we'll have a short comfort break, after which I'll introduce our next speaker to you and our next topic. So for now, please do enjoy this engagement. If you have any questions, comments, or anything you want to ask, please do pop it in the chat, and I will monitor the chats and alert the speakers to these comments. And please also do make sure that you do, if you can't get in the chat, please private message myself or Anne, just so that we can assist you, or if you're having any problems with regards to sound, etc. It's very important to us that everyone feels and stays engaged in the process. Prof, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction. Okay, in this talk, I think the first thing to be cognizant of when you approach supervising the MBAs, MBLs, and the MComs is all three of them are vastly different student bodies. The only commonality they have pretty much is the M in the title of the academic pursuit. But other than that, they come from different backgrounds. The qualifications they're undertaking are all very different, with different goals and different outcomes. And the actual research output that they produce is also different. And historically, or at least from my experience, what I find typically is there's 2 variations that you get around this. The first one is around the students themselves and how you supervise those students. And the second issue that could crop up is actually on examination. I'm not sure how many of you are acting as examiners for these types of students, but if you've examined for a long period of time, you've probably determined already that they are very, very different, and the requirements of examining these students is different as well. And typically what we see, at least from my experience, year after year after year, where we do get very negative reports, examiner reports coming back, particularly with MBAs, it's very often quite clear that the examiner doesn't quite understand the requirements and the output of an MBA versus an MCom, and kind of expects the MCom and the MBA to pretty much be the same thing, which they are not. They're vastly different. So that's also something to bear in mind. If you're going to be examining, just be clear exactly who you're examining. It's not correct to just say, well, I'm examining an MBA, now I'm examining an MCom, and I'm examining the same. It's not realistic to do so. From a student background perspective, generally the MBAs what we find, at least based on the statistics that I've seen from South African universities, they tend to be much older than MComs. Some of the MComs, though, depends. For example, some of the more specialized MComs, you do find the more mature students. So typically for the MCom, they've gone through their education, they've gone through their training. They're now in a position where they're not as aspirational as an MBA would be. So career change, for example, is not one of the main drivers for an MCom, whereas very often it's very common in an MBA. And likewise, an MBL kind of sits in between the two as well. So whereas an MBA typically has some education, has some work experience, and now is kind of looking to move either up the ranks or change fields or change careers, MComs is much more focused on development, on self-development and career development. So the need for retraining in an MCom is less common than it is in an MBA. Very often I have MBAs who come to me and they might come from technical backgrounds, but they have no business background or no business education prior. And they're looking to now branch out into business, get involved either themselves as entrepreneurs or involved in NGOs, or making societal changes, or move up the ranks into companies themselves and into corporations, and therefore see the MBA as a means of assisting with that transition. The difficulty that I've seen, at least over the last 12 years I've been supervising, is very often students don't quite give enough cognizance to the thought or the idea that in order for this to transition to be successful comes at a cost, in the sense that they need to decide how important the actual final mark is to them versus the actual education and new skills that they're going to acquire during the MBA research report process. Some students come to me and they want to transition, they want to learn new skills, and they also want a first. That's virtually impossible. And I tell them this quite upfront, that if you are an MBA student and you are actually looking to transition into a new field or change careers, and you're going to likewise then need to learn new skills, the actual uptake of that new skills requires a lot of time, it requires a lot of effort, as opposed to a student who is just merely going along writing a research report or a dissertation on something that they already know, they already got experience in, they've been doing it for years. It's very easy for them to write that type of research report, and by all means they can go ahead and they can aim for a first, and very often they will get a first. They're very familiar with the material that they're writing about. It's not the case though for an MBA student who's transitioning. So one of the first things that I do when I meet an MBA student who is in this position, that's one of the first things I question them on. What's more important to you, an actual final mark of a first or the actual skills? Because in order to put in the work to gain the new skills means that you can't devote your time and effort to producing a first-class research report. You just don't have enough time, especially on an MBA. It's so time pressured that the amount of time you're going to have available, let alone the amount of energy that you can have left at the end of an MBA when it comes time for the research report, is insufficient. If you had 2 years or 3 years and you were going to do your MBA research report, well, then maybe you could get a first. But most of the MBAs, at least that I know of, they want to get done and get out and done quick as possible. MComs are very different in that regard. An MCom that I typically see, they're very established, they're very motivated, they know exactly what it is they want to do, it's related to what they're doing already, they're familiar with the techniques that they're going to be doing. So it's very much a case of trying to produce the best dissertation that they can with the skills and knowledge that they already have acquired, rather than necessarily transitioning. There are MComs who do transition, and I regularly see them every year, but they have a longer period of time to do it. Because they have a longer period of time, they can put in more work, and they can therefore aim higher for a first-class pass, as opposed to an MBA, which very often, and over the numerous MBAs that I've supervised over the last decade or more, that's generally what I find is they get the skills, but they don't get the mark, and they need to really understand that it's difficult. It's very difficult to get both. And if you have that conversation with them right at the get-go, it does make your relationship with your MBA students a little bit smoother, because they understand where you're coming from, they understand the expectations, but they also understand that there is this trade-off. Where you get the disappointment down the line is where students have put in a lot of work and they don't get the mark that they anticipated. even though they've learned new skills and they have new skills that they didn't have before, and they're more they're ready to join the workforce in this new area that they're looking to engage in. MBA by its nature is a competitive type of degree, and very often the focus is on marks rather than on skills. So I would certainly recommend have this conversation with MBA students, especially right at the front, and then let them decide if they are willing. If they say that's okay, I'm willing to give up the first, I'd like a first as much as possible. I'm willing to put in as much work as it takes to get a first. But if I don't get a first, I want the skills. The skills are actually the main goal of a career-changing MBA. At least then they're much clearer about it at the beginning. MComs, however, as I mentioned before, they tend to be much more established. So in terms of actual research outputs, I find most of the MCom students are really the ones that ultimately you can take and a year later, take them and transition them into becoming a published paper. It's much easier with an MCom than it is with an MBA. An MBA just doesn't have sufficient scope. It's very seldom that I see MBA's dissertations that can be transitioned into an actual academic journal article for a good journal. MCom is much more likely. An MBL is more akin, depending on the credit rating associated with that particular aspect. The MBAs, as I mentioned, also they tend to be much younger than the MComs. Not as young as overseas, as I'm sure many of you know, the overseas MBAs, and we see that even when they come over here to South Africa, they tend to be very young. And that also creates a lot of unusual class dynamics as well, where you have very young students with South African and other African students tend to be much more mature and more established compared to MBAs. Something which isn't mentioned on the list is the EMBA research report. EMBA research report is very, very practice orientated compared to an MCom and even an MBA. Whereas the new options now, of course, of doing teaching cases for MBAs and also doing company analysis reports for MBAs as well, which are much more practical orientated. And generally, however, in terms of going from MBA, and MBL, EMBA, etc., and MCom into a PhD eventually, the transition associated with that is the easiest with the MComs. EMBA is a very poor gateway into a PhD. It doesn't have sufficient resource grounding. MBL potentially could be depending on the topic, and it depends on the depth at which it's actually been explored. And an MBA would take a lot of work to get to PhD level. Once again, because it's effective, it is a mini dissertation. It doesn't have the grad depth required as entry for PhD. So these are very, very different students with very different motivations, very different age groups, very different outlooks, very different positions in their lives as well. They also tend to be much more transitional among the MBAs. We find MBAs, they're at the university and then they're gone either back to their home country or some other part of the world, whereas MComs are much more established in wherever it is that they're doing their actual work, and that is related to their research. So the research around MComs very typically is much more focused. Whereas the benefit of that is that when you get an MBA student, there's a very long period of time where they have to explore to actually get a research topic. They have kind of an idea that they'll arrive with, but to actually take that idea and hone it down into something that can be researchable, a lot of MBAs battle with that. They very invariably what you find happens is they come with a very broad topic, and then their research questions tend to actually be individual dissertations. It's kind of, they're not interlinked in any way. Each one of them is like a separate dissertation. And MCom is very different in that regard. And MCom, I typically find, is much more focused when they arrive. They have much clearer understanding of what it is they're trying to do. And then it's more a case of honing it down and fine-tuning it. So that initial educational phase of really learning how to research, really learning what it takes to produce research and to learn how to research is much steeper for an MBA than it is for an MCom. An MCom typically has much more of a research mindset than an MBA, which is much more commercial mindset. And a lot of MBAs, they come to, especially if they are in an institution that requires them to do a research report as opposed to a teaching case or a company analysis, they're very hesitant about the whole exercise to begin with. They don't see the point in it. It's just something they've got to do, and they're going to go through and try and get it done as best they can, as quick as they can. So the motivation is different. But having said that, a lot of MBAs also do make the mistake or have the mistaken perception that doing a case study is easier than doing a research report, which is grossly incorrect, because doing a teaching case on an MBA has a whole set of prerequisites, and to produce a good case in the time frame of an MBA is also very difficult to do. The structure, of course, is different to what you typically find in a research report as well. The preparation required, however, can also be problematic in that very often the MBA say, I want to do a case study on the organization I'm working in, but they don't have proper access, they don't have the case idea properly set up, and they land up in conflict very often with personalities or with the facts in the company that they're actually trying to do the case study on. So doing a teaching case is not an easy out for a research report on an MBA. It's a different animal, and it's also a very demanding animal compared to just doing a good old-fashioned research report. So having said that, with these different students, then depends on the different skill set they're looking to engender. And it also depends on what is it they ultimately want from the MBA or the MCom. And that's typically, that's what I discussed with them right at the beginning. What do you want from this thing? Typically, the role of an MCom dissertation, MBA dissertation, EMBA dissertation, whatever it may be, is to fulfill a particular role in the educational cycle. You've gone through all these different courses, you've put in a lot of work, you've had many assignments, and so you've built up this massive body of knowledge. The research report really is supposed to do two things. One, it's supposed to give you new skills in how to do research, how to really interrogate data and facts. But the other side of the research report is to transition academia now back into the world in which they're going to go and engage in. They've had relatively sheltered periods of time in the time that they're doing their academic pursuits, regardless of whichever one it may be. And unlike a PhD, where most of the PhDs we see are part-time, they're already in the world of work as well at the same time as doing their academic studies. Many of the master's students are full-time in academia. They're doing their courses and their studies full-time. They've been removed from the work environment for a long period of time, including some, for example, the module MBAs or some of the MComs who come on block. So the research report now is to transition them into the work environment with the skills that they've learned, and to put it in practice with something that they can then show a potential employer or whatever it may be, and whoever it may be. These are the skills I have. This is what I'm capable of, and this is what I can do. So naturally, of course, it means that it presupposes that the work they've put in during the time that they've been engaged in their academic pursuits is at a sufficient level to actually assist them in the research report. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. So ideally, we like to think, yes, every student we have is brilliant. The reality, especially when it comes to research report writing time, is the weaknesses of students really become apparent. And in particular, there's two that I see very commonly. The one is an inability to write in academic style, and the other one is in just basic mathematics, mathematical concepts. Both of these are very weak, very common. Unfortunately, it is something that we're seeing much more common than we would like to see. This, once again, as I mentioned before, means that there's additional time that has to go into the actual supervision of these students. You're going to be receiving all the drafts and need to give input for the students' work as they're progressing through this journey. So if you have a student, like I mentioned before, they're transitioning from one area into another, and they want to learn new skills that they can then take with them, those new skills typically have to come from you, which means that the amount of work and energy you put into such a student is in excess of what you would for a student who's well established. They know what they're doing, they're happy with their field, they know the literature, and they're off and they're away. Effectively, what supervision under these circumstances means is that you're actually going to be teaching. And for the duration of their research report, that is what you're doing, you're teaching. And ultimately, of course, all research reports do involve a degree of teaching, but the level of supervision required for a transition or a weak student is far in excess of the brilliant students. And they're the ones you're going to have to spend most of your time on. drafting, redrafting, finding holes, filling holes, trying to get students to understand that the document has to be a unified document. How do you go from an introduction? How do you define proper research questions? How do you take those research questions and draft it then through your literature review, then through a methodology, and have a discussion at the end on what you find and what you did? Most students are, especially in the early phases of, for example, an MBA, they really battle with this. And what you find when you start reviewing the documents they send you is there's these gaps between the sections. So each section is kind of a self-contained piece with very little interlinks between them, and the logic still hasn't been formed. And MCom is much quicker at this and is much better at this because of the requirements of the courses that they undertake as part of the MCom. But they're much more systemic and systematic about how they approach a research report, whereas an MBA is much looser. And this therefore places a greater burden on you as a supervisor. So even though an MBA research report might have fewer credits and has a tighter time frame, generally, at least from my experience, I find supervising MBAs is far more demanding than supervising an MCom. The only time they're kind of equal is when you get a very weak MCom, then they're probably equivalent. But most of the time, supervising an MBA is much more demanding because there's so much skills that has to be imparted in the research process themselves to get them to a level of actually conducting concise but in-depth research is a very steep learning curve. Examination, likewise, is also problematic in that regard because the MComs have the space and wherewithal to write a bigger, more in-depth, a more sophisticated research report or dissertation than an MBA can. So the MBA's document by its nature is smaller. Now, when I supervise the MBAs, I supervise the quantitative studies of MBAs just as I supervise the quantitative studies on the MComs. I don't differentiate between them in that regard. As far as I'm concerned, a concise MBA dissertation should be just as publishable as an MCom dissertation, even though it uses fewer words. And it's very, very seldom that my MComs hit the word ceiling anyway. I find generally our word ceiling is around about 25,000 words. Most of the MComs can do a really good publishable dissertation and hit around about 18,000 words. MBAs around about 16,000 words. So you don't need lots of words to write a very good MCom or MBA dissertation. And it's something that I always warn my students is, if you give me lots of words, it's going to come back bleeding red because it's not about words. Anybody can write waffle. And unfortunately, that's what students tend to do, especially in the literature review. It's very kind of he said, she said, he said, she said, and goes on for pages of he said, she said, but there's no argument, there's no understanding of what the literature review is for. And a large portion of the supervision time that I spend with students in MComs and MBAs is really around filling in these gaps, but also getting them to understand what the purpose of the literature review is. They kind of understand in theory because they've done a little bit of research methodology, they've read, and they have a general idea of what a literature is supposed to do, but doing it in practice is a very different animal. And it's a very difficult thing to do, especially when it's the first time you're doing it, for example, on an MBA. You haven't done this before, and now suddenly you've got to write what is to you a very large literature review. So there's lots of rabbit holes, lots of dead ends. And your role as a supervisor at this stage, what I would recommend, I know it's worked for me and it does work for other supervisors, is allow them to rather just send you bite-sized chunks of the literature review rather than a finished literature review. It just makes it so much easier to find right at the beginning when they start going down the rabbit holes or they start going in circles, just how to kind of head them off at the pass and get them back on track. Whereas if they send you completed large portions of the research report or the dissertation, it's not only going to take up a large portion of your time, it also makes it very difficult then for them to correct it down the line because there's going to be so many strands and they can't quite figure out what you were saying here and how it ties up there. To keep it small and manageable, both for yourself and for the student. It means, of course, there's much more constant engagement as opposed to one big chunk of work. But it's much more timeous in the sense that you can catch problems and weaknesses much quicker. So the other thing related is also for when you're doing cases, the the case methodology is very different. And I can't speak for other universities. I know at the GSB, we focus on cases to a large extent because we produce so many of them. But a lot of students don't really understand the difference between writing a case and writing a research report. They don't understand the structure of it. So if you don't have a lot of experience, and I don't, I'm the first to admit it, if you don't have a lot of experience supervising cases, I really wouldn't recommend doing it as kind of just to get going. I would rather say co-supervise if that's possible. I wouldn't conceive of supervising a student who's doing a case with the limited experience I've got anyway. So it's just something to bear in mind that kind of, if you're going to be, and as the education institutions change the different forms of these dissertations, consider co-supervision when you're not sure about structure. I've done that in the past with especially, for example, qualitative studies. I don't do a lot of qualitative research. So, but where I do have students who are kind of doing mixed methods, for example, co-supervision is brilliant. And you learn a lot yourself as a supervisor in addition to the student, of course. So don't be too negative about considering co-supervision when needed as well. Okay, I mentioned, about research training. In terms of research training, from my experience, what I find is some of the students that come, especially on the MBA, that are transitioning, some of them do have, a few of them do have either very good quant skills, otherwise on the MComs also, they'll have very good quant skills, but they typically want to take those quant skills and learn new techniques that they've never tried before, which is experimental naturally. So where this becomes interesting is that when writing up the methodology part, they kind of au fait with the mathematical descriptions that are going to be used. When it comes to actually running the actual analyses, that's where they kind of take a long period of time and going to require a lot of guidance. Once they've got that and they've got the outputs, the interpretation is then once again quite quick and they're on their way again. So as opposed to students who have very limited quantitative backgrounds, and they want to do it inside a research report. As I mentioned before, this now is a very steep learning curve and is going to require a great deal of your time. And generally, what this means is that when you have your initial meetings with these students, you need to consider, let's say you are approached by 6 MBAs, for example, and you meet all 6 of these MBAs, and each single one of them are trying to do a transition in some form, and they don't quite have the skills, they don't have quantitative backgrounds or whatever it may be. You need to ask yourself the question whether you have capacity to undertake that degree of supervisionary oversight. It's a very demanding on your time. So you might have to limit the number of students you take as accordingly. You can't just kind of go in guns blazing, I'll take as many students as I want to, and it'll all be great and we'll do it as we need to. You need to consider the demands on your own time as well and your sanity as well. So be clear-sighted about the amount of students that you take on. Very often we see, especially unfortunately among junior faculty, they tend to get overwhelmed and overloaded with supervision. And it's mainly because the senior faculty aren't as interested anymore in supervision. They'd rather be doing research and publishing books and going to conferences and doing all the glamorous stuff. So the supervision load starts to kind of filter down to the junior ranks. And then what we see is the lecturer and senior lecturer levels are just overwhelmed with endless supervision. And this is incredibly detrimental to your own development in your own careers because you don't get the opportunity then to do any research. So I mentioned before, you can take some of those research reports, some of the good ones anyway, and try and transition them into being published papers. I've done that with a few of my students, and it works pretty well. But at the same time, you've got to consider you taking some research that's been done between you and a student, as opposed to you and collaborating with other faculty and other researchers, which would be on a slightly different level, and therefore you could target a much higher journal. So you kind of need to be clear about where it is that you're aiming, or what level of academia you're aiming at, and what level you are at as well. But the one thing that I would say is, and it's something especially if you're at lecturer or senior lecturer level, is you need to be very careful about the number of students you take on in supervision. We see this, and I've seen this year after year after year, where we see lecturers and senior lecturers who get burnt out just because of the amount of teaching and the amount of supervision that they required to do as a result of this filtering down that I'm talking about. So be very clear-sighted about the students you take on. Make sure that you have good discussions with them before you take them on. Don't commit to students just because they come knocking on your door. It's a common mistake that we all make. We're all enthusiastic. We all think everybody wants to produce great work and everybody wants to do brilliant research, but not everybody can. So you need to understand and take cognizance of the supervisors, of the students' differing abilities, and then determine whether you can actually meet the needs of that student. And in many cases, I've learned it's much kinder to be harsh. It's not kind to have a student who's going to battle for an entire year to produce something that's second rate. It's much better right at the upfront to say, look, the amount of time this is going to take, the amount of skill that's going to be required to pull off what it is that you want to actually do is beyond the scope of an MBA, or even very often it's even beyond the scope of an MCom dissertation. And I regularly see MComs who come to me and they basically want to do a mini PhD. It's not possible. And it's much better to rather give them some guidance around how to hone it down, how to use it as a means to explore something they can then develop later on down the line, rather than say, okay, well, let's give it a try and see how it goes. They don't have that option. They don't have that luxury in the academic qualifications they're doing. There's very little room for experimentation. And that's why I mentioned right at the beginning, if they are willing to experiment by learning new skills and new techniques, the cost of that's going to be their mark. So if they still want to have a brilliant mark, but they want to learn all the skills, they're going to run out of time. One of the three is going to give. So it's all a trade-off, and they need to decide which one of them they're willing to trade off. They're either going to run out of time, or they're just not going to get the skills and therefore not produce a good dissertation, or they can get the skills, be on time, but then they're not going to get the mark thereafter. It's all a trade-off, and they need to determine which one it is. But likewise, you also need to be clear-sighted as a supervisor of what the student's capacity and capability is. And there's nothing wrong with asking a potential student to supply you with an assignment or a piece of their work as an example, just to see how do they write. Can they write academic style? Because otherwise, if you know nothing about the student comes and knocks on your door and says, I've got this idea, I'm doing a dissertation and I want to do this and I want to do that. And you think, well, okay, it's quite a stretch. It's quite a difficult thing to do. And you know nothing about the student. The first time you're actually going to start to get an idea about the student's capabilities is when they start sending you the initial drafts of their proposal. And then suddenly it might be a very horrific wake up of, whoa, wait a minute. I don't think the student can actually do what he or she is claiming or desiring to do. And then you've got a problem. So just ask the student up front for a piece of work. There's nothing wrong with that. You're in an academic institution and they're a student producing academic work. So you can get an understanding of where they're at. What is their writing style? Bearing in mind that typically writing for an assignment is not a really good indicator of how they're going to write a research report, because the research skills are very undeveloped by the time they start their research report. It's something that's going to develop as they get involved. But it'll give you a clear understanding of the logic of their writing style, of the ability to put their thoughts down on paper and so on. So it'll give you a much better understanding of exactly where they are, and then you can determine for yourself whether you want to take on the student. You don't need to feel that you have to take on every student. If the student doesn't come to you, they'll find another supervisor who they fit. Ultimately, that's what happens with students. It's incredibly seldom that I land up with people knocking on my door saying, I have no supervisor. Nobody wants to touch me. Nobody wants to do any research with me. It doesn't invariably happen. People land up going to the supervisor that meets their needs or matches them. And if it doesn't meet their needs, well, then that's something else that happens. And it's something else that you might experience as well, where you're supervising a student and the relationship either breaks down or the actual topic itself develops beyond your area. It's not so common on MBAs. I've seen it happen sometimes on the MComs, and it does happen on the PhDs, where the research kind of develops outside of your area. In a circumstance like that, there's nothing wrong then with saying, well, maybe we should look at co-supervision. In a worst case scenario, the student might need to change supervisors, but that's very seldom at a master's level. I very seldom see that. That's typically a PhD level problem. So then, as I mentioned before, just as the student needs to be clear-sighted about what their expectations are, you need to be clear-sighted about your own expectations of the student. of what the student's capacity is, capabilities, what it is potentially you can teach the student in the limited time that you have available to them, because they're not the only student. Invariably, you're going to have other demands on your time. Besides supervision, you're going to have teaching and research as well. And then also, to what extent can these students this body of students that you get, to what extent can they work as a portfolio towards the betterment of your own research? Is there aspects of your research you're effectively kind of farming out to these students and using them, I wouldn't say as guinea pigs, but effectively they are kind of like little research guinea pigs. You're trying different topics, you're trying different research ideas to see how they function, how they work, what's the literature, what's the interlinkages, and so on, and that aids your own research as you develop thereafter. In an ideal situation, of course, you'd co-publish with the student as well once they finish the dissertation. But otherwise, use the students, and that's why students are attracted to specific supervisors with specific topics. It's not random. And that's likewise the reason why if they don't fit, send them to someone who does. Don't try to put square pegs in round holes. You need to be clear about what it is you're trying to do with supervision. Supervision isn't just societal engagement. It's part of the academic project. And it's part of your own academic development as well, and your own research development as well. If I think back over the years, most of a large portion of the papers that I've written and are in review, and the book I'm writing at the moment, it would have been impossible without my students. The ideas I get from students, even the poor ones, the students who they muddle on through and they battle their way through the techniques, and they kind of something pops out the other side and they get through and they're okay and off they go. Even those students I've learned from. So you will learn from your students. It's not a case of they're just going to be taking up time, unless, of course, they're not a fit, in which case then you shouldn't have selected them in the first place. The responsibility is on you as the supervisor to accept the student. The students will come and knock on doors, and they knock on many doors, but it's your responsibility to take the students that match your needs, match your expectations, and match your research. If they don't, they'll match somebody else's and send them on their way. So the thing to be clear about is right from the get-go, make sure you understand what the student expects, what you expect, what time you have available, how the student actually benefits your own research. There is an element here of being selfish, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's your own development as an academic. I think as you move up the academic levels, senior lecturer, and then eventually associate professor and professor, this gets a little bit easier, and you kind of learn to be selfish, and it's okay. When you're first starting out at lecturer and senior lecturer level, there's kind of this guilt of saying no, and that potentially can be very harmful. So the one thing that I always tell the faculty that join, at least at the GSP, the lecturers and the senior lecturers, one of the first and one of the lessons that I wish somebody had told me right at the beginning is it really is okay to say no. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying no. Somebody else will come along who meets your research needs, who's going to be an excellent student, who you're going to gel with, who's going to produce a really great piece of work. And if you'd taken on all those other students, you wouldn't have had that opportunity. Instead, you would have had a very frustrating time. So get used to saying no. The students adapt. You're not going to hurt anybody's feelings if you say no. It's very seldom students get grossly upset. PhD level, yes, because they got a lot more invested. But at MCom level and MBA level, students very seldom get upset when a faculty member says, sorry, I don't want to supervise you, it doesn't meet my needs, or I don't have the time, or whatever. They understand. And they say, okay, I'll find somebody else, and off they go. So don't be too ashamed about saying no. It's all just part of the academic project, and it's all just part of protecting your academic turf, as it were, which is your knowledge and your knowledge development. Let's see. Scope and credit. Okay, well, I've spoken a little bit about that already, but the scope and credit of an MBA is kind of the lightest of the three between MBA, EMBA, and MCom. And likewise, the actual time devoted to each of these, however, can actually be inversely proportional, depending on the quality of the student. The better the student, of course, the less is required. I've had very good students who I've reviewed basically 2 drafts, and it was great, and off they went. I've had students where I've gone literally every day, I've asked them, they had to send me something. And as you can imagine, that involves a lot of time. Now, if I had, which is one of the guilty ones, when I first started my academic career, I was regularly supervising 20 students. if I had 20 bad students, I would have a really lousy year, and I would burn out. It would be impossible to do it. So you need to understand that if you have your students, you kind of think of your students like a portfolio, where you have good students, it's like stocks. You have good stocks, you have bad stocks, you have stocks that are outperforming, you have stocks that are long-term, you have stocks that are short-term. And that's what your supervisory students are like. They're like your academic portfolio, your knowledge portfolio. And they all have different needs, and they'll all perform at different rates and at different speeds, and they all have different demands. And you need to consider each one of them independently, but also as a whole, because you have very limited time and energy as well. There's no point producing in a year 10 excellent students who all got first, and then that's the only 10 you ever produce, because by the end of the year you're burnt out and you have to leave academia. What's the point of that? So you have to also consider your own needs as well. There's nothing wrong with being selfish. And increasingly we are finding where in institutions, in academic institutions, where faculty are getting burnt out, especially post-COVID. The administrative requirements on faculty has increased dramatically. So faculty don't have the time anymore for supervision. They're complaining, and rightfully so, they barely have enough time to even do research. So faculty already are prone to burnout, already suffering with high workloads. So be careful if you are sitting in a situation and an environment like this, where now you get a whole lot of students banging on your door, and you just take willy-nilly, yes, I'll take you, I'll take you, I'll take you. And you'll end up with this plethora of students that now devote your attention as well. It's very easy by the end of the year that you're completely burnt out. At the beginning of the year or the middle of the year, you could still have some energy, but the amount of work required for the supervision during the course of the year is going to sap all your energy as well. And you need a plan for that you can actually get through the year and then make it to next year, where the whole cycle starts all over again. So as I mentioned, so just be sure about who you're taking, why you're taking them, what their expectations are. Make sure their expectations match your expectations. If they don't match, then that's fine. It's not a train smash. Let them go on their way and find another supervisor, which they do. Year after year after year, that's what happens. Supervisors come, supervisors go, students come, students go. People need to be able to work together so as to produce the best output. And that requires getting the best from the student. And the only way you can get the best from the student is if you have a good relationship with that student, where you understand what they're capable of, what they want from the actual research process, what you expect them to produce from the research process, how that goal is going to be met, at the same time, how you're going to devote all your time and your energy to your whole range of different activities, so that you have enough time for research, you have enough time for teaching, you have enough time for administration and supervision as well. But don't take on too many students. That's the one thing that I would certainly like to press upon you. Very often also is with examination as well, is bear this in mind also if you are examining students, that the MCom and the MBA are not the same thing, and the requirements are very different. Very often we see that the reports we get back from, especially faculty that haven't examined MBAs, they tend to examine the MBAs like they would an MCom. I don't quite understand that. They're two very different animals. So if you are examining, make sure to first just look up what are the requirements of an MBA, because you will find that they are very different to an MCom, and approach it like that. That's not to say excuse second-rate work. There's no excuse for second-rate work. But the time limits and the depth of capability on an MBA is more limited than on an MCom. And when examining that's something to bear in mind. I'm not too sure how many other universities do it. At the GSB, we make sure that to provide a template, a marking template for external examiners, particularly on the MBA, just so they have a clear idea of what it is they should be looking at or what they should be looking for. But other than that, most of the examinations that we find do go very smoothly. And very often when they do raise queries or they do raise questions or concerns, usually those are the same things. You'll find if you're engaged in supervision, they kind of mirror your own thinking. It's very seldom that, at least from my experience, it's very seldom that I'll get an external examiner report back and I'm very surprised by it. Kind of like, yeah, I know that. They kind of pick up the weaknesses that you would have been exposed to during the year as well. Oh, yes, okay, sorry, I forgot about the chat. Okay, I've got about 10 minutes left, so let's see, I'll just take some questions in the chat. If we assume the level descriptors are at the same level, how do we deal with such an assessing the research outcome? Ultimately, it has to be a good piece of research, which means it has to satisfy what one would expect from any piece of research. It has to be concise, it has to be interlinked, it has to be logical, it has to be factual, and it has to, and this is something which I press upon the students right at the beginning, it has to do what it set out to do, which sounds simple, but in reality, it turns out to be quite difficult. Very often students will describe the circumstances in the introduction, kind of allude to a problem, define some questions, go through a literature review to show, yes, this is a realistic and this is an actual gap that can be explored, conduct an analysis, discuss what they find, but actually never answer the research questions or do so very vaguely. So it has to be very, very structured, just as if you were writing a journal article. And the students that I've supervised that have taken their dissertations and turned it into journal articles, that's generally an easy process for them. If it's difficult to do that, then it means that you basically haven't produced research that's suitable for a journal article, because it's not at that level. It hasn't satisfied the requirements of being concise research, of suitable research. Scope, how deep, how wide, critical, yeah. Potential, okay.
Apologies that I got cut off.
No problem. I'm not sure if there's any questions. I don't think there's any in the chat.
There were questions. I don't know if you've been able to. So I was, my questions were deleted, obviously, when I had to rejoin. But there was an earlier question from Benny Anderson. I'm not sure if you've answered yet. Prof. Ben, I'm not sure if you're on, if you could ask your question, just because I got cut off when I rejoined, I lost the questions. It's regarding the NQF level. So if the MBA and the MCom are at the same NQF level, you know, the difference in the research, and then Prof. Ben, I see you on, so you can continue with your question.
No, I think, thanks. I think the question is partially answered. I was just curious how people will think around this, because we are, as business schools, probably also challenged with the fact that somebody may come with an MBA to do a PhD, or come with a MBL to do a PhD, or vice versa. There are different mixes. And I'm just thinking, how are we going to overcome the potential discrepancies between scope of work? Because I think the level descriptors provide a great guideline for me, you know, but I'm still sometimes wondering, because I can see the difference sometimes. And you know, you almost have to do additional work then with an MBA student, graduate, to actually do a PhD, because the underpinning methodological and design and typologies are just seemingly lacking. So I'm just curious, you know, how, Sean, how do you deal with this?
And then, sorry, Sean, and then just following on to that is the similar question, which was also posed by you, Ben, which was in terms of the question of scope. So how deep and how wide is critical? How do we relate potential differences? And, you know, what would be the ideal number of students to supervise was another question, but I'll pose that afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, looking at the first one, it's a very real world problem, and it's one we've battled to deal with over the last few years. We now, as basically, we don't allow EMBAs to enter the PhD at the GSB, and it's just because of all the years we've battled with this. You mentioned before, it just the different degrees offer different outcomes, and some of those outcomes are not suitable for entry level into a PhD. MBAs can get into a PhD, but as you mentioned, it takes a lot of work to get into a PhD, to bridge that gap between an MBA and a PhD. It's a very wide gap, and it's even wider for an EMBA. So we very seldom take MBAs into PhD, and we don't take EMBAs.
But now I wonder, Sean, what does that then do to the, Because I think the level descriptors was intended, you know, when we said the MBAs must also be at NQF level 9.
Yeah.
Then a student almost have the right to say, well, I've got an NQF level 9.
Yeah.
And therefore I'm competent at 9.
Yeah.
How can you not take me in the same field of study, let's say marketing? How can you not allow me to do a level 10 marketing focused doctorate program? And I think that was something we struggled with when we did the doctoral reviews at universities, at the CHE. That question we were confronted with at many institutions, because students were asking that. How dare you tell me I can't now do a level 10, but I've got a level 9?
Yeah, that's it's a valid question. I think in the example you gave, from the GSB side, if the master's student came to us and they had a first in their master's, the GSB, when we do the applications process for the PhDs, we also ask them to write essays and a few other things that we use. So if they got the first on their master's, whether it's an MBA but not an EMBA, master's, MBA, MCom or MBA, and they satisfy the requirements of those essays and they prove their case as it were with the essays, then they would get onto the PhD. EMBA, however, we find time and time again, it might be an NQF 9, but it's a different type of NQF 9. It's, you know, the GSB's PhD program is very academic focused. It's not practitioner focused. So we do get EMBAs. I mean, we have a very good EMBA program. So naturally our EMBAs themselves say, well, we want to get onto the PhD program. It's a natural thing. You know? And invariably what ends up happening is we have to send them to other institutions because we just, well, besides only having a very few spots for PhDs, we're not practitioner focused on a PhD program, whereas other business schools are. So I think it's also, we kind of, over the years, we've kind of learned what we're good at and what we're not. Whereas before it was like, come, you know, let's see what happens. And then it doesn't work out too well. It's like I was saying before, I think we need to be comfortable with saying no. And really considering how best to assist the student even when saying no.
Thanks for that, Sean. Prof Anderson, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think just from an accreditation point of view, the debate is on again, what constitutes an NQF level?
Yeah.
Because the students are starting to argue that. And I see Helena says, you know, it's not a right to get into a doctoral program. Well, Helena, that will apply to any program. There's no right to anything. But if we put out that NQF 9 is a prerequisite for NQF 10, this does pose a challenge. We, as you said, on the EMBAs, you know, I mean, is that at level 9? Or is it a component of it at level, or is it at level 9 to a limited degree, but it doesn't meet all the level descriptors? For example, I'm not sure that the knowledge creation part is really at level 9 at an EMBA.
Yeah.
It's a philosophical yet debate that's got a practical implication for our customer base.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Prof Anderson and Prof Gossel. So we are coming to close to 4, but if you don't mind, Prof, if we can just answer, there's quite a few questions, but some of them will carry over to the question session. But there was a question with regards to the ideal number of students to supervise in your view. I think it's quite a quick answer, so to speak. So perhaps if you don't mind tackling that one before the break.
My ideal that I try and aim for is 3 MComs as a max. As a max, I would do 5 MComs a year. And depending on the type of MBAs, if they're transitional MBA, 3 MBAs. I actually do more MComs than I do MBAs because the MBAs I find require more work.
And then would that also include doctoral? Because I think a lot of institutions have policies connected to how many masters and doctoral students in total, and many work off the caveat of say 10 at some institutions, where others go up to huge amounts of students. So 3 and 3. So to answer the question, it's about 6 students, MBA, MCom 3 and 3. Interested in the comment section to see what others think, which takes us to 15:59. So if I could please ask if everyone could take a coffee or tea break. Prof Gossel, if you don't mind, the overflow questions, if we can do after Prof Barnard. And
Yeah, no
then,
problem.
so please feel free, everyone, to grab a cup to drink, to run to the bathroom or whatever you need to do. We can please re-meet here at 5 past. The time now is 4 o'clock. If we can re-meet here at 5 past 4. Logical flow, that golden thread that so many people unfortunately forget about as students and as supervisors. So certainly going to be an engaging and a dynamic session from Prof Barnard. So for those of you who do not know Prof Barnard, I'll just give you a drop of the background. Prof Barnard joins us from Gibbs, where she's responsible actually for the Gibbs doctoral programs, and she's a multiple published author in various A-rated journals, and very much focused on international business studies, management studies, world business studies, etc. But she is a mover and a shaker in terms of when you want to speak about disruption, because she researches both organizational mechanisms, very much focused on both at an organizational and the individual mechanisms around various areas, particularly oscillating between developed and less developed countries, and particularly with a focus on Africa. So her work often is dealt with in very turbulent, uncertain conditions. That's why I said if you want to move and shaker in turbulence and chaotic times, Prof Barnard is certainly for you. But it is not only that, she's also a forerunner in terms of seeing the benefits around professional organizations, having been the person who developed the proposal leading to the Academy of Management. And today she sits on the Academy of International Business. She was their vice president for administration, and she's currently the founding chairperson of the Emerging Markets Special Interest Group for the Academy of International Business, which I think is so needed. And this is alongside all the additional work she's done, as well as being a fellow, etc. So you are certainly in very capable hands. I hand over to you, Prof Helena Barnard.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen, so let's hope I get it right.
I'll let you know when it's showing, Prof. Yes, we can see it. Can everyone else see it? I can see it.
Brilliant. So, in terms of the outline, I want to talk a bit about the architecture of research, the big picture first, and then the details, and then go down into expectations of masters and doctoral students. Unlike Sean, who really started by talking about the differences between these groups, I'm taking the reverse approach, and I'm starting by talking about similarities, ending with the differences. So if we look at the big picture, research is nothing more than a meaningful question with a robust answer. So we need to have a question that actually matters. We don't want some trivial question. We don't have time to waste on that. And then we try and find an answer that we can actually believe. And if we think about this question and answer dynamic, it repeats a number of times that you have a question on something, and then you find an answer to that question, but then it triggers another question. And this process repeats before, during, and even after the research, because all good research will end with new questions. So you maybe have a student who's like, is it possible for minds and communities to live in harmony together? And then the answer is, but wait a bit, I know of some communities that actually do have a positive relationship with the mind. So maybe the question is, why do some communities have a positive relationship with the mind and others do not? And then the answer is sort of like, I wonder if the answer is, it could be the mind. These are all different minds because they're all different communities. Is it maybe that it's something about the relationship rather than a specific mind? So what you can see is in this process, which I'm sort of enacting as a sort of reflection, but is basically what goes on in the mind of any researcher when they work through a process. You constantly cycle through from a question, and then the literature answers that question. It's like, oh, okay, so that's what we know. But if that's what we know, this doesn't gel with what we see in South Africa, which is this. So it raises a new question. And it's totally expected that this is going to be what happens. But then what happens is that bad research has a bunch of questions, a bunch of answers. Sometimes the questions come after the answers. They're not really aligned. Whereas what you want in good research is for a question and an answer to that question. And Sean actually said students don't necessarily have an alignment between what they set out to do in the first part of the document and in the second part. So in your experience, and this is just to help me as I go through, do students struggle most with the question? Do they struggle to find a useful question? Do they struggle most with the answer? Or do they struggle most with the alignment between them? So if you can just in the chat box pop A, B, or C, A for the question, B for the answer, and C for aligning the two. That would give me an indication as we go through today of where to place the emphasis. So I'll let you guys do it. Really just, I see we've got A's and C's coming up, A's and C's, A's and C's. That clearly signals we don't have to do so much work about the answer section. I'll come back to this section. One of the things that I think is very useful is to remember that research has a very formulaic structure. You'll see that all these are romance novels, Mills and Boon, Harlequin type novels. And the characteristic of this genre is when you pick up this book, you know that this man is going to fall in love with this woman by the end of the book. On the first page, they're going to start having a fight. They will meet each other. And then you're going to read for 150 pages, but you actually know where it's going to end. If we compare that to detective novels, in a detective novel, you are constantly trying to guess. So is it this one or was it that one? And the fun of a detective novel is, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that was so-and-so who did it, or it was everybody who did it, or whatever the answer is. And because of this characteristic of research, when we share the research, we do not want surprises. We want to share the research in the most formula-like way as we can. It actually makes the job of a supervisor quite a bit earlier. Now, I don't want to suggest that the process of research is formulaic. It's incredibly difficult. But precisely because the challenge is to come up with new ideas and new insights, the structure of a thesis is very, very formula-like or formulaic, which sounds even worse. So I always say to my students, think of this as a romance. We need to know on the very first page what you are going to be doing your work about. It's not a detective novel where you keep the reader guessing until the last page. And because we have this process that's a cycle of thinking about the question and the answer, which then triggers a new question and multiple answers and multiple questions, because of that, iterative process gets written up in a very strict formula, which is a question followed by an answer, you can actually help guide your students about how to report their research. And that process often gives you levers as a supervisor for how to support them. So let me get to there we go. Are there any comments or questions at this point? I'm going to go through it. If ideas pop into your head, by all means, put them in the chat box.
I am monitoring, Helena. There aren't any questions that have come up specifically as yet.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Marla. So let's go to the architecture of research and into the more detailed view, because it's useful to demystify research by saying, listen, it's just a question and an answer if you have an anxious student. And I do find it helps. But in the end, we all know you need to have several thousands of words of nonsense. So we need to delve beyond the big picture architecture. And if we think about the typical structure of a dissertation, you'll have an introduction, you'll have a literature review, you'll have the research question that comes out of that literature review, and then you'll have the research design methodology, and then you'll have the results and the findings with a discussion and a conclusion. And I think that most of us will recognize this basic structure. But if you think about it, it actually is a breaking out of the question part, because the first part is all about what am I trying to understand and what do we know about it already and what do we not know about it, ending with the research question. And then the answer, how am I going to answer this research? So when we guide our students, we want to make sure that in selling to us their study, they first explain the question and then they go into the answer. And in order to understand the structure of a thesis, it's useful to think about the purpose of each section. This diagram is really, it was shared with me by a fairly high-profile scholar, and it has really changed how I think about scholarship myself and also how I supervise my students, because each section serves a purpose. And there are very specific questions that need to be answered in each section. So your introduction fundamentally has to answer the question, what are you studying and why does it matter? And we're not into practice, and how much we are into practice varies per degree, but we are an applied field. So we need to, this is not philosophy. We need to have some link with practice and then, of course, to theory. Again, the literature review should tell us both what we know, what does the literature already tell us, but also where we have a question. I'm not sure this works in a country with this level of inequality. I'm not sure that these people have tried to explain this with so much turbulence. Whatever the literature has done, you need to engage with it critically so that you can say, actually, there's a gap here still. That ends up in a specific research question to say, given that we know ABC, but we've only studied them in wealthy countries where there's absolute stability and peace, what happens when we put this in a turbulent context? Then you have to design an answer. You need a method to come up with an answer. So that's your research design. You've got the question and now you're going to come up with a way of answering it. And in your results or findings chapter, you will say what you found and how you interpret what you found. So you can't just put a table in there with descriptives or whatever. You need to say, this is significant, that is not significant. Or in qualitative studies, you can't just give us a whole bunch of quotes. you need to identify the themes of those. That then will get into a discussion about how does this contribute to scholarship, theoretically and practically. So why does it matter what you found? So what? And then finally, in the conclusion, there's a what did you study and what do we now know that we did not know before? So once we understand that each of these sections, there's a big front half, which is positioning the question, and then the second half, which is giving the answer, and that each section has to answer certain questions, it becomes much clearer to guide a student who is trapped in this cycle of questioning and answering and questioning themselves, because you can actually say to them, where are you? Let's figure out about what it is that you are trying to do. So let me, for some reason, there we go. Now I want to emphasize, this is stylized. Different schools and different supervisors have somewhat preferences following the same general format. I'll give an example from Gibbs. The point that we have about the research question being a separate chapter, we require that for the MBAs, because for many of the same reasons that Sean mentioned, their argumentation is not always that sophisticated. And sometimes you at the end of this literature review and you have no idea what is the research question. And we found that requiring that little chapter helps them to keep track of where they're going. But on the MPhils or the doctorate, we do not require that. So it doesn't matter what's the exact format of your school, but there's a general logic. And even if you go and look at journal articles, they tend to follow similar structures. So the next question that I would really like to know is...
Sorry to interrupt. I just thought Monwa BC's just asked a question that I think is relevant to your point before. The question is, does the framework, theoretical or conceptual, feature in the literature review in this structure?
Absolutely. So your conceptual framework, well, it also depends on whether you are doing qualitative or quantitative studies, because with qualitative studies, you may end up with a framework because you don't know, but typically your framework will be part of your literature review section. This is where you are building an argument. So what I would really like to know is, when I share these formula-like guidelines, students sometimes get offended because I'm putting them in a box, quite frankly. And I'm saying to them, these are the questions I want to see, and I do not care how creative you are. This is what I require. When I share them with you, does it feel stifling? Does it feel neutral? This is just the way the world works. Or does it feel empowering? And I'd really like to hear from one or two people. If you don't mind, you can put up your hand or unmute yourself. Comments?
I see people are being very quiet. So does anyone want to answer if you think how students will experience these formula-like guidelines? Do you think they'll find them empowering or stifling? If you want to pop in the chat. So we've got an empowering coming through there, Helena coming through in the comment section.
Thanks, Elise.
Actually, I think it is quite stifling for anyone else to just give a format, because you are actually constricting that person from being innovative and creative. Thank you very much.
So we've got various responses here, Helena, most saying empowering, some saying specifically for MBA, and then Dr. Heather Good says it depends on the personality or experience of the student. So the student's own frame of reference will determine that as well. So very varied responses there to the question, Prof.
This goes into the writing style and thinking style of students. I have found this really works incredibly well with architect type students who like a plan, they like deadlines, they like to say, I'll get you this by that point. Whereas students who are more discovery writers find it extremely difficult to upfront say, this is what I'm going to be doing. So I give it to all my students because I find it empowering. But one of the things that I've learned is that students struggle sometimes if they are more discovery oriented. What is important though, is that in the end, this is the convention of scholarship. So in scholarship, when you submit a journal paper, those need to be the sections that are covered in your article. You don't need to make them separate headings, but if you read a typical article from a good journal, you will see that these different elements are there and the questions are being answered. So from my perspective, in terms of the initial experience, in terms of the initial trying to find their voice, some students do much better having less structured approaches, mind maps, or some send me PowerPoints with loose ideas. At the end, what will be examined is going to be measured against these headings. This is what scholarship involves. So use your judgment in terms of the student and in terms of the process about why, at what point are you asking for something that actually looks like this. But it's very useful for students also to give them the outline to say, this is what I'm expecting to see from your final, as the questions that you need to answer in each of your sections. So let me go to the next slide. So if we look at the introduction, many students struggle with what to put into the introduction because it's what are you studying and why does it matter? You know, I've read 20 pages about unemployment in South Africa and the need for job creation, and then the student is proposing a very excellent study on, for example, necessity entrepreneurship, becoming opportunity entrepreneurs. But I don't need 20 pages of it, but what do we need? And one of the things that I find very helpful is to say to students, your introduction gives an overview of what to expect in the article, in the thesis. So use the entire outline and answer all the bullets from section 1 to section 7 and explain all of these in your introduction. So I'm studying how necessity entrepreneurs become opportunity entrepreneurs. This matters because we have a joblessness crisis, but it also matters for entrepreneurship theory because we don't know how this transition tells us. What does the literature tell us? Well, you can cite 2 or 3 references, but there's a very little work. The best we have is 1 paper. So by answering these questions, you ensure that the overview, the introduction provides an overview. What I often do is I make them write that first. And that is why my discovery writer students struggle, because they don't work with a structure up front. But what I find is if I have an idea of where the student is aiming to go, by asking them to give me these answers, it's possible to say to students when they start losing alignment, for example. So the literature review builds an argument. I think it's very true that the conceptual map that has to be there, the framework has to be there. I often say to the students that it's a lie. It's not a review of the literature. It actually provides an argument. And that involves explaining what we know and what are the building blocks that we can use in this work, and then what we don't yet know and therefore need to study. One of the things that I also do is if a term is in the title, it needs to be a main heading in the literature review. And there should be 2 or 3 terms per thesis. So one of the problems that students have is, and why they get lost, is they're trying to say, I'm going to look at psychological capital and how it works with self-leadership and how self-leadership works in the African context, and how together all of this is going to improve firm performance, because you're going between levels of analysis. It's not sure what theory-based firm performance typically goes to strategy, but leadership is its own field. Psychological capital is organization behavior. So the best way to guide students is by limiting them to a few terms in a thesis, a few constructs in a thesis. So if you are interested in how opportunity entrepreneurs become, and necessity entrepreneurs become opportunity entrepreneurs, those are the 2 headings in your literature review. You can add an introduction and you can add a conclusion, but it often helps students a lot if you clarify with them what are the 3 maximum constructs that this research is about. How do you see them standing in relationship to each other? So the relationship between the mind and the community, and how that leads to peaceful coexistence. Well, how are you going to measure that? Is it maybe, less violence or whatever? And then you have the main headings is something like the relationship between the mining and company and the community. Then you can have subheadings under that, and you have to. So you have to have relationships where the mine is the main actor, and relationships where the community is the main actor. You can't just have one big main heading. But to help students to structure their thinking, use the terms from the title as the main headings and limit those so that you can be as focused as possible. And then I've already spoken about the research question chapter. Very short. It is always required to have a research question, sometimes just one main question with 2 to 4 related sub-research questions. Let's stick to the relationship between the mind and the community. You can have one between, where the mind is the active party who initiates things, and where the mind is the receiving party, and where the community is the active party and the community is the receiving party. So you have 4 sub-research questions, but they all go into the heading. It's not required to have a separate chapter for this, but it really helps for especially MBA students to make sure that they're explaining exactly what they are proposing. It helps them to not lose track of what they are trying to do. Let's go to the own practice. So when do you ask to see this first part? I mean, by the time you've got the introduction, the literature review, and a research question, you've dealt with section A, which is a lot of you have identified as a really important challenge for you. When do you ask to see it? And how complete do you want it to be at that time? Sean said he really prefers to get short bits, because at that point, if they're losing the track, you can actually get them back onto the road. But other people prefer to have an idea of their overall thinking of the student. What is the preferences in terms of your own practice that you ask for students in terms of that initial part? I'd love somebody to talk or to put in the chat box. And I want to emphasize, yes?
No, I was going to say you're welcome to pop in the chat box if you'd like to.
It really is your own practice. I often say to students that a supervisor-student relationship is a relationship, and what works, we have supervisors that I know, he or she will be brilliant with this student and terrible with that student. So there's not really a right or a wrong. What is relevant, however, is for you to understand what are your preferences so that you can ask yourself, does this work for me optimally, or could I perhaps change this? So Nomusa wants to see an introduction, what they want to investigate, an early research question. Okay, then the literature review. So let's figure out what is a research question, and then let's build up the literature review. One of my colleagues does a brilliant thing where he says, send me your research question and there's 3 articles that you see as central to this research question. Because then he says, just seeing those 3 articles, you can tell the one article is in the Journal of Public Policy, the next one is in the Journal of Marketing, and the next one is in the Journal of Strategy. So you already can start saying to the student, oh, I'm going to need for you to refine your question a bit. So Letitia, deductive approach to your master students, could you perhaps just explain what you mean with that?
Hi, Lena. Yeah, I'm just kind of expanding on what, so we always start with kind of a question, especially our MBA students, because they tend to do things within an industry or an organization that they are familiar with, either working in or so. So, you know, start with what do you want to investigate? So like you say, you know, if you're in a mine or, you know, looking at stakeholder engagement with the community or, you know, just that example. But then I really like what you said as well, you know, because we tell our students as well, what's kind of in your title, because they will be, you call them terms, we call them themes or concepts. And then, you know, we need to unpack the literature around that. But of course, it's underpinned by some kind of theory. Our school focuses on 4 or 5 main theories. So they got to do stakeholder theory or resilience theory or systems theory or, you know, RBT, resource-based theory, or those kind of things. And we introduce them to that, and we kind of have that as the lens through which they do that. So some of the things are a little bit in parallel, but, you know, in my mind, a student still needs to know, well, what's the question? What am I interested in investigating? And that obviously changes as things evolve, because then you find that, oh, it's been done, or there's not a lot of literature to support it for a half thesis or whatever that might be. So yeah, a little bit flexible, but we tend to try and steer at least our MBAs, because it's a half thesis, into a more deductive kind of approach. What's literature? Go and investigate that, just to try and keep it a little bit simpler.
Okay. One of the things that I've had is students who absolutely love writing. At the drop of a hat, I will get 70 pages and then I'm the one who has to read it. And then I have other students who will avoid writing altogether. One of the things that I've done is I've made it a rule, I will not meet you if you don't submit something to me first. But that something can be a diagram, it can be PowerPoint slides, it can be a mind map, because it is important to allow space for students to have different approaches to how they get into the literature. So when we get into the research design or the methodology, you're starting to go into the answer part. And a good research design is like a recipe. Remember, in management research, for us, the gold standard is replicability. If somebody doesn't believe what you found, they should be able to replicate what you've done. And your methodology has to have enough details in it so that a person who is skeptical can replicate that study. And I've often found that the students who do best at this methodology are the solid C students who are very diligent, who will tell you, I did this and I did that and I did that. The A students want to make it too theoretical and philosophical, and along the way they don't actually tell you what they did. One of the things I find very helpful is the DEJA acronym. Define the method that is being used. I'm using narrative inquiry. Explain how it works. Narrative inquiry involves blah, 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 blah. Justify why it is the right method for the problem. I'm interested in hearing the voices of these women, blah, blah, blah. And then you apply the method. And it is surprising how often students will not actually do all four, or they will tell you how they apply the method before they've defined it. And it's your sort of guessing game to figure out, well, what on earth is this method? So I find that they get the DEJA acronym. Your research design methodology chapter sometimes includes the proposed analysis. I will analyze systematically, and sometimes it's a standalone chapter, especially with some of the complicated stats. Students will want to put it all mixed methods. Sometimes students feel that they want to explain the big picture first of they're going to do this and this, but they want to discuss the analysis second. The rule that I think is to keep in mind is this a recipe? Can you follow it? So if it's in the same chapter, but it follows logically, you first gather the data and then you analyze it, and you explain first gathering the data and then analyzing it, then it really doesn't matter that much whether it's a standalone chapter or not. Different institutions have different preferences. And what happens then is if there's an external examiner, typically the examiner will be given the guidelines of the institution to make sure that they don't say, yo, this is a very long research design chapter. Why don't you break it out and put the analysis separately? If the institution wants it to be as a single chapter, as long as the sequencing follows the sequence of activities. If you think to the recipe, you expect them to ask you to fry the onions first, and then later you add whatever. So you don't want the onions to be added as an afterthought. So with the methodology, it really is important that the sequence is followed in the way that it's going to happen. So if we go to the results or the findings chapter, it could be qualitative, SMEs from low-income countries internationalized because blah, 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 or some tables with fancy stats or whatever. And basically, this is the what. What did you find? So these tend to be facts. They need to have been interpreted in the sense that we don't just want the quotes. We want you to, the student to have gone through and have said, okay, there are lots of people who talk about, you know, we're a low-income country and we're small, and, you know, the local market is too small, we have to go international. There needs to be some conceptualization and integration, but basically these are the things that can be supported by facts. The discussion chapter is the so what of the answer. So if your findings are the what, the discussion is the so what. So it makes sense of what it is that the student has found. So on its own, we don't know why it matters. And your discussion chapter will typically marry the literature review and the findings chapter. So you can expect to see the literature has found X and Y, but the stuff on Z was contradictory with all kinds of sites. And these can be repeated from your literature review. The findings from the study has found that Z is very strongly affected by its context. That this is different from prior literature where the context was not relevant site. Therefore, so in your discussion chapter, you want to make sure that you say, I explained in the literature review that here's the conceptual framework, here's how these things work together, but we don't understand this lever. Now that I've done my analysis, I've actually have found that this conceptual framework is missing an element, and I'm adding another element into it. So you have to go back and refer to the conceptual framework, but at the same time, you have to go back and refer to the findings. This is the marriage of the two. So the answer part of the thesis is, in my experience, often done in a big rush. And it's been one of my big frustrations. How do I get my students to focus on their findings and on the discussion? Because it's as if, obviously the data analysis or the data gathering always takes longer than you thought. You thought you were fine because you're using archival data, but the archival data needed to be cleaned. And now the findings, you're not sure that you got it right. And in my experience, it really ends up being shortchanged, especially for the MBA students who are just keen to get this done. So what can you do to get your students to focus on the findings and the discussion? Any comments in the chat box? Any hands to be raised?
There weren't specific questions with regards to this, but there are some questions from earlier. Helena, if you would like to tackle some of them, obviously connected to this. So one of the questions was regarding the introduction as the first chapter. What is your view on writing in the past tense or the future tense?
So typically a proposal is written in the future tense because you are submitting a proposal and you're saying, this is the research that I want to do for my master's thesis. And then that gets assessed and we say to you, you're trying to do too much or whatever. By the time you are submitting an introduction, you've done the work. So I would tend to do it in present tense. One of the things that I, however, know is that universities have very strict ideas, and I can never remember what the Gibbs idea is. Thank heavens on the doctoral program which I run, I just did away with it because it really is a style matter. And I think as long as people understand that this work is done, and what sometimes doesn't happen is students don't fix it when they go back to it. So in fact, they've written it in the future tense as part of the proposal, but they say things like, I will gather data. By the time you've written the introduction and submitting the thesis, you have gathered the data. So there's for me a logical thing, but I'm going to say, go with what your institution advises. For some reason, people spend lots of energy on talking about that.
Thanks, Prof Barnard. And then there were just some comments speaking. I like the Deja approach as well as the marriage part, literature study and findings. There were quite a few people who commented around that question. But there was a question asking how long is the chapter? And then it says research question. So I'm not quite sure if that's the methodology chapter that is being referred to. I would assume so. So
no,
also, I don't know if you want to comment.
It's the research question chapter. The longest I have ever seen it was 4 pages, and I've often seen it as 1 page.
Yeah.
And really, this is a little piece of scaffolding, a little step ladder for students who confuse themselves, because once they know that in this chapter, I need to say, sometimes they add their hypotheses or their propositions rather than their sub-research questions, but it gives them a space to actually just capture their thinking. And what we found as supervisors when we talk to, is it the question that's the problem or the answer or the alignment? Very often the research question chapter, even though it's 1 page long, helps massively with the alignment, because it's almost as if it forces the students to think, okay, so this is the question that I'm trying to answer. It also helps you as a supervisor if you can say, well, in your chapter 3, you're telling me this is your question, but this is a firm level question. And now you're talking to individuals about their gender and whatever. That's an individual level thing. How are you aligning these two? So in my experience, the research question chapter is the most valuable chapter for its length. A large part of it is because it's a very short chapter, but we have them give maybe one paragraph to say, given that the differences in how minds and communities relate, this study is at its heart concerned. The main research question is, what is the relationship, what makes the relationship between a mind and a host community be, what determines what it's like? And these are my 4 research questions. So it's short, it's really not a long chapter.
Thanks, Helena. Letitia, I see your comment about some of the suggestions on the questions on the screen. I think I've gone through all of them except for some of the earlier ones from Prof Gossel that we'll get to. Is there any others that I've missed out, Letitia, that you want to raise specifically? Augustine's commented, I found that students always include the research onion, the visual and the research methodology chapter.
I think that's totally fine. We do not allow it on the doctoral program because at this point you really need to have internalized that. But if we think about how MBA students have to think about alignment, that research onion really seems to help them. And in fact, one of the things that I challenge students on is like, okay, so you've got the onion here. Let's talk through your logic. And let's see if you are actually doing justice to the onion. So for me, it's a useful tool that I can use to start a conversation with students.
Thanks. And then Letitia, is there anything else here that you've added in? Jody's commented, I think, to keep ensuring you as a supervisor link the findings and discussions back to their bigger why. It needs to link to their personal values. Why spending time on these will serve your greater why rather than just the research why and purpose, which I think is very critical as well.
Yeah. So I must be honest, I do that on the doctorate. I say to students, don't change your topic to try and get a supervisor. This needs to matter for you. What we found is that many students, when they start out, their why is a very big picture why, and they need in a very short period to come up with a business question. If you think about an MBA, we have students who do their MBA. In the course of their MBA, they engage with some social enterprises. They realize, oh, but we've got this terrible inequality in the country. And then you need to get that student to come up with a researchable project. And I think that's where Sean's comments were really wise. Have a conversation with them about what they want. The time is so short, they cannot develop new skills and get a distinction and serve their purpose and this. So I tend to be quite driven, I think, with students in terms of the MBA students in particular. There's a deadline. What are you going to be able to do in terms of that particular deadline? Cool.
So Helena, I misinterpreted Letitia's question. She said she wants to hear your suggestions on your questions because she's interested to hear your suggestions on these questions that you posed.
Okay, so the one thing that I do is whenever I get my students, I schedule a reminder in my diary for 3 weeks apart to just say, write to Letitia and Marla. And then after every 3 weeks, I write to them and I say, while I was on my walk this morning, I was thinking about you, which is not really true. And I'm wondering, how far are you in terms of your data analysis? Remember, this is a project. It's a big project and an important project, but like all projects, it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and we need to be closer to the end by now. So one of the things that I need to do is I see myself as an important part of my job to be the pace keeper. Like I'm one of those people in the marathon who runs little bits with the runner, because if they don't get that reminder about managing time, they tend to get stuck in the first half and they don't get to the second half. In terms of the findings, it depends whether students are perfectionists or not. I have actually stolen a student's stuff. She brought me all her copies and she wouldn't let me review it. And I grabbed it and I sat on it and I said to her, I'm pretty sure what you need now is my feedback. So I'm not giving it back to you until you've polished it even further. That's obviously not always possible. She was very indignant. But I do think that it's very important to understand, to make them understand that this is not about getting it right. This is about getting it out so that you can get the feedback. And on the discussion, I find that what really helps is to have a discussion. So what I'll sometimes do is we'll have a chat, and if it's on Zoom, I'll say, I'm just going to record this to make sure we have a record of it. And then we discuss the findings, but I'm having it transcribed as we talk. And I'm like, how did this link to the literature? But wasn't that literature like that? So for about half an hour or so, we actually have a discussion on what they found. And I'm the one in that conversation bringing in the previous literature that they've done. Here's what I found. Our students are really good at speaking their thoughts. The world of management, you need to be able to stand on your feet. You need to be able to justify a position. So because these students are so comfortable talking through their material, they can often explain to you in words, especially when they relax and they're not totally paranoid about, this is my thesis and I need to get it in. But you're like, so was this what you expected? And how is this different from that? And isn't that exactly what so-and-so said? So did this disappoint you, or do you think you added something? So at the end of the conversation, I send the students the text file and I say, rework this as the basis for your discussion chapter. Because very often what they can speak out is much clearer than what they can write out. And then they have a draft that they can work with. So I've done that quite a few times, especially with students who are stuck, and talking through this really seems to help them. Any other comments or questions before I jump to the conclusion?
No further that have come up on the chats, Helena.
Very cool. So the conclusion goes back to the beginning and it wraps it up by linking to the future. So I often say to my students, take your introduction, which you have to rework in any case now that you know what you're really saying, and copy and paste it in as the conclusion and delete half of it and make it the same length again. So a part of it has to, because you want it to click, to connect the end and the beginning, you want to be able to repeat and say, this thesis examined this because this is important. So you're going to, at this point, definitely talk about your past tense, but you future oriented in the sense that you say, what I did has these limitations. We need to look at other things in the future, but we now have make a difference to our knowledge. So by using the conclusion and making them copy and paste, literally copy and paste, and then deleting half, it actually helps the students to feel less insecure, if you wish. And it helps the reader when it goes to an examiner, just feels that it's smooth, that it ends where it started, more or less. So I often start, I've said this before, asking the students to write the introduction using that structure, those questions, to give us a map. It changes. It changes because they can't find the data they thought. It changes because they find different literature. It changes for all these different things. But in terms of the discussion, then I say to them, go back, rework the introduction to make sure that you get the alignment right. And when you rework the introduction, write the conclusion at the same time. And because your introduction, your conclusion are written at the same time, you actually ensure that you've got greater alignment. Adiola, I'm definitely sharing these slides. I was nervous about running out of time, so I actually wrote out quite a bit of detail there.
Yes, I was busy responding to for everyone's questions, and we'll make the presentations available as well as the recordings to everybody.
So I want to speak a little bit about the expectations of master's and doctoral students. And basically, my contention is all research follows essentially the same format. So journal articles, doctoral dissertations, master's thesis from MBA, MCom, MPhil, you all have this structure of a question followed by an answer. And then all of them have this formula-like presentation of the research. My reflection is that it's actually done that way because the novelty should be the content. It should be the insights that you came up with, and it helps us when it's more formulaic. So you know this part is the stuff that is coming from prior literature, and then at the discussion we're going to go back to that, but also bring in the findings. So the formula helps us to focus our attention as readers on what's actually new. So what is different? At a master's level, your student must demonstrate mastery of the process of research. And it's possible to get a distinction for a master's thesis that's superbly executed, that makes no new contribution to knowledge. And for me, the funniest case where this happened was I had an MBA student who wanted to do her work on imitation. And literally that was the topic. And she did a brilliant job in terms of going through the literature and identifying this is what we know about imitation. And these are, I can't remember what was the gap that she found. She found that the literature had been done, the most of the literature, I think, had been done in high-tech industries, but how does it work in low-tech industries? We don't know. And we need to know because low-tech industries also matter. And then she did fantastic field work, and imitation is exactly the same. Doesn't matter whether you have high-tech or low-tech. But because it was so brilliantly executed, she got a distinction for her MBA. At a doctoral level, you must develop new knowledge. You need to demonstrate to the reader that you've added something that was not there before in our knowledge. And the mastery of the process of research is a given. So the way I visually capture it for myself, if we think of a continuum, Gibbs doesn't have MComs, we have MPhils. I think, you can have so many fights about, is this the right sequence? But basically there needs to be a solid body of demonstrating mastery of the process of research. Do you know how to engage with the literature? Do you know how to build an argument? Do you know how to construct a research question that can actually be answered? That's not just philosophical meanderings. Can you come up with a research design that matches that? Can you, in your discussion, integrate the new knowledge with existing knowledge? So all of those are skills. And one of the things that Gibbs is very proud of is that we believe that these skills are actually transferable skills that you can use in workplaces as well. When you are able to construct an argument, there will be a time when you need to tell your manager that she's proposing something that you disagree with. it's a transferable skill. Development of new knowledge is required at the PhD. At an MBA, there's a little bit of it, because most of our students, we're in the fortunate position, we're in an under-researched context, and our students are contributing to the knowledge base. But what we can see is it gets much more as people continue further on. In terms of how the NQF levels then superimpose on this, there are multiple conversations that we can have. One of the things that annoys me about the CHE descriptors is that they say professional doctorates can be done as well, but then they have exactly the same outcomes specified for both, so that you are really limited in how much you can really be practice oriented. But in terms of how you assess this, for me, it's really about at an MBA level, MCom level, all of them, we need to see that you know how research works. That's what gives you at least an NQF 9. When you go beyond to an NQF level 10, we need to see that you're contributing new knowledge. Obviously, our distinction students on master's level are already going to be contributing new knowledge. Okay. I think that is it for me.
Thank you so much, Prof Barnard. I'm sure you'll all agree that it was really an incredible presentation. I know there are questions, but I think we'll just take a short break till 15:15. So it's about an 7-minute break. And then there'll be 45 minutes of questions where we'll start off with the questions that have already been posed, that people have been waiting for, and then we'll go on to the other questions. So please take your break, enjoy your cup of tea or your quick stop somewhere, and then we'll see you back here at 5:15 for 45 minutes Q&A with Prof Barnard and Prof Gossel. Thank you. A lot of people have wanted to ask some questions. So if you don't mind, Prof Gossel, we're going to start off with some that were connected to you. So one of them was from Elsa, who asked, how can an MBA develop themselves to the level of MCom? Do they have to register for an MCom, or is there any other route given your earlier discussions, Prof Gossel?
It depends what they want to do. If they're looking, for example, to do a PhD, what I typically actually recommend is if they want to register for an MCom, that is quite a good way of doing it, because generally what happens then is the MCom becomes like a mini PhD, and then they can use that to then springboard into the PhD by exploring what they're exploring in the MCom in more depth. But they don't need to go that formal. I've had PhD students who have come from MBA, and they take about a year to basically just read literature, really get their thoughts down and prepare themselves so that by the time it comes to apply for the PhD, they can produce a PhD quality entry proposal. So there's the two ways of doing it. You can either go the formal route of doing an MCom as a way in for the PhD, but that's not a given. It's not a necessity. It is, by the time you reach the PhD application phase, you need to prove you've reached that level. How you do that, whether it's formal or informal, is up to you.
So I hope that's answered your question, Elsa. There was also a comment earlier. You would have seen that Anne popped into the chat that SABSA is going to be developing a supervisor and examiner database, obviously for people that are willing to participate in that. And there were questions asked about how people will know about this. I'm assuming that you will be sending out a communique through SABSA and potentially posting something on the website. And I'll let you answer obviously to that end, but one of the things that people really liked Prof Gossel in your presentation, and Helena, you also mentioned it, was the suggestion of co-supervision, because people spoke to the fact that it allows people to build confidence and competence and create their own structure or framework of the supervision process that you presented to us, both of you. And I do think that this co-supervision is really critical. So for example, at Da Vinci, we require someone to co-supervise before they can supervise on their own. So I do think that those are really important elements for us to consider. So thank you to both of you. That was, people commented that they really liked that suggestion because it brought about confidence. Yeah, it's a means of mentorship as well. We find particularly with the junior faculty, when the junior faculty co-supervise with senior faculty, the senior faculty actually get as much out of it as the junior faculty do. Kind of learn by doing, and a lot of times by the time you reach the senior levels, you've forgotten a lot of stuff. And it's nice to be reminded of it when you now need to start start mentoring somebody who's now entering into academia. So the mentorship as through co-supervision does work very well. We found that as well. And then there were some comments around the fact that some people found that supervising a PhD student that had done an MBA, they were in agreement with you that this was quite tough. And I mean, Helena, you answered obviously around that doctoral programs are not a given and just some of the areas that people could build up towards this. But I think that's quite a pertinent point, given what, Ben, you spoke of earlier, is that, I mean, it is clear that at times students that have done an MBA really do struggle then on the PhD from a different research standpoint, taking on that more sort of robust type of research. So I definitely think this is a debate that we might need to continue further, and because it does seem to be brought up by quite a few people that even if institutions are allowing access into the doctorate or for the MBA, that supervisors are actually seeing that there is a sort of a lag. I'm not sure, Helena and Sean, any comments with regards to that from your side?
Practically, Sorry,
Sean, you go first.
Okay, sorry, I'll just make a quick point. When I get MBAs that tell me they want to do a PhD, generally what I tell them is if you consider a PhD is at least around about 6 chapters, each chapter would basically be more than equivalent to the MBA they just completed. So they need to consider and ask themselves the question whether they would be willing to spend time doing 6 MBA dissertations before they consider whether they would want to do a PhD.
So if I can come back, we all developing countries, it's not just South Africa, but we have a critical shortage of supervisors. That's our shortest, our most limited resource. And when I took over the doctoral program, one of the issues that I have, and this is to Obi's question, how can you transform a person from an MBA into a PhD? It's very inefficient to do it individually. It's very inefficient for somebody to come and sit at Sean's feet or my feet or whoever's feet and listen to us. And so Gibbs has actually developed MPhil in evidence-based management that is a kind of a bridging course. So, and apparently CHE has said that there's a need for that because most MBA students who go into doctoral study are not well prepared. So we do in that we have 3, 4, I can't remember, thematic modules. And these are reading under guidance, where we interrogate you. You can read on whatever topic you want, but we're interrogating you in terms of, so why did you choose a journal from such a paper from such a terrible journal? Or why did you, choose half of your papers are from policy and the other half are from strategy? They're 2 different audiences. So, and then we go into research design and we do a course in research design, 1 in quant, 1 in qual, and then we have a course in applied research design. The final deliverable is an integrative research design. That is the applied research design where you have to actually design a methodology. and a structured literature review for one construct, for a single construct where you have to come up and say, this is the state of the knowledge. We don't require that for entry into the doctorate, because you have entry into the doctorate in terms of NQF as soon as you've got level 9. But we have a very robust selection process where we have 3 faculty members all review applications according to a rubric, and you have to write comments, and then we literally can take less than a quarter of the applications we get. But then, because we have students who've done an MPhil in evidence-based management, they take 80% of the spots because they have been trained how to be scholars. The other 20% are brilliant MBAs, brilliant MPhils who worked on corporate strategy or whatever, who've got some research training, but this really develops a proposal. What we have found that I'm really pleased about is it has really changed our racial and gender composition on the doctorate, so that we are completely demographically, it's not an issue for us, because the moment you give people that kind of support, it's no longer relevant whether you had quant skills or not. At the end of the MPhil and EBM, you can do stats. So we've really found, we have lost some students who took the proposals they developed to go overseas, to go to UCT and Stellenbosch, but and other universities that probably are represented here. So we can't take all the students we get, but it has really lifted the quality of scholarship. So for me, it's very important that we see this not as you have this or not. It's not an endowment. It's a skill that gets developed. But it's unfair on supervisors to ask them to develop those skills. It's just too time consuming. And to do this in a context of class-based teaching just is more efficient. So, sorry, that was long.
Thanks, Prof. So if there was a comment that was, if an MBA student expresses future ambitions to do a PhD, would that change the manner in which you would supervise them, considering Prof Gossel's advisory regarding the time scope, new skills trade-off? Would it be correct to advise them to pursue the production of an excellent study with high marks and contain scope to an area with which they're already familiar? I asked this following the comment that MBA applicant admission to PhD program tends to be lower in comparison with the MPhil and the MCom applicants. So I'm not sure which one of you wants to tackle that, Prof Gossel, if you want to, or both of you.
Sure. Yeah, I don't mind. It's one I am actually asked about quite regularly. My answer to them is, how important is the PhD, in the sense of, is the PhD in a field they're familiar with, in which case then they need to go for marks. Mainly because then it's going to cut out a little bit of the bridge between MBA and PhD by producing a really good MBA that can then be expanded into the PhD. If the PhD is not in a field they're yet familiar with, it's highly unlikely that the MBA is going to do the job anyway. So it doesn't mean they should give up. It means that they need to start considering what after the MBA. So they could use the MBA as a means to start developing the skills, but they're going to have to develop further skills after the MBA as well, which means it's a much longer process to be able to do it. So there isn't really an easy answer to the question, but it is very much a real world question, and it's one that we are faced with, because typically MBAs, being aspirational, do see the PhD as some kind of lodestar to aim for by its very nature. But getting there from an MBA is a difficult task. It is a very steep climb. So I think as I mentioned, I think it just comes down to, is it a change, a field change, or is it a continuation in where they are already, that kind of frame where or how they get there?
In my experience, the students who are MBA students who do well on the doctorate are the ones who love the research component. They don't try and do well. They just love doing the work, and therefore they end up doing well. So if there's an instrumental thing about I need to do well to get there, that in my experience, there's a skills component, but there's also a huge emotional resilience. I know of more students who are brilliant and didn't make it because they couldn't sit on their backsides for long enough. Then I know, there are many students who are not brilliant, but they could sit on a backside and they came out with a PhD. So I think there are many factors in the mix.
Sorry, just something also to add to that. Generally, what I've found is students who do approach me like that, I tell them, okay, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we take your MBA research report and see if we can turn it into a publishable paper? And very often what I found is that the students go through the process and the rigor required to publish the research report and turn it into a journal article. And once it gets published as a journal article, they're satisfied and they say, that's it, I don't need to do the PhD, I've had enough. But usually I use that as kind of a stopgap of saying, okay, well, let's see if we can get your research report published. If we can, well, then maybe we'll take it a step further.
Okay, thank you. I think that definitely answered it. So the next question is to both of you. And it's sort of a bit of a double barrel. Some were private message to me and some not. So I'm just kind of summarizing it. A lot of the people are asking, how do you then go to the next step and escalate someone from an MPhil, an MCom, an MBA, whichever one, to really get that master's thinking to a PhD or a doctoral level thinking? And again, the question came up connected to this, when you've got a student that holds onto a topic or idea that you really feel isn't feasible at a doctoral level, how to sort of tackle that, because obviously you're dealing with someone who believes that they know about research at that stage. So that's just a summary of those questions together. If I haven't honored anyone's questions by summarizing it, please do pop a comment and I will rephrase.
So I'll be quick this time. We offer the MPhil and EBM. And if you are not prepared to do that, then you don't want to upgrade your skills. So it really is liberating because it takes the responsibility after the individual relationship. There's a structured program for you to do. So that resolves it. And then what we find is that research is an incredibly humbling process. It is a process during which you will be wrong more often than you will be right. You will be rejected more often than you will be accepted. And if students have that arrogance of not accepting feedback, we don't accept them. So if we've told you, obviously with an MBA, you need to get them through. But if they don't demonstrate willingness to accept feedback, we know they can't do it, because research is about creating knowledge where knowledge does not exist. You need all the help you can get. So if students are arrogant, we just don't accept them.
I think that's actually, that's a good point. I think it's something that students aren't quite aware of when they do start to transition from master's into PhD, is the degree of rejection and harsh criticism that they will be exposed to through journals, examiners, and so on, really steps up a level. And a lot of students aren't prepared for that. They're kind of expecting that kind of the nice tempered comments that they typically get when they were doing their masters. And the PhD level, that kind of that buffer is, in large extent, is removed. And we find very often that students get a bit of a shock at just how forward people are with their feedback about the work that they're doing. So that's also part of the supervision and the supervisory oversight, I think, that many of us need to consider also, is how do we prepare our students for that degree of feedback, which for many students is the first time they experience something like that. They used to kind of just, we do good work, we get the results and we move on. Now suddenly it's not so simple anymore. People pick things apart. And for a lot of people, that's a shock.
Thanks. And I think that also, Lena also commented about students and recent graduates, speaking to students. One of our recent graduates, doctoral graduates, is actually on this call today, Dr. Pillay, and she also comes and speaks to new doctoral students to really speak about the journey as one of our representatives as well, being both an industry practitioner she is, as well as someone who has done her PhD. So I think that's also really important in order to do that. Are there any other questions? I think I've covered all the questions and the direct messages. I do know that Ben did message me direct to say he wanted to still speak about the introduction, Helena, that you commented on around writing in the present, etc. But I think he has dropped off. I don't see him on anymore. Benny, are you still on? If not, perhaps he can take it offline as well. Are there any other questions? You guys are welcome to unmute your mics to make any comments, or if I've forgotten a question, you're welcome to just unmute your mic and raise the questions in an open forum. I think it's important for us to be able to engage. I think both of you have offered us a wealth of information, but if there's specific questions or burning questions you'd like answered, please feel free, or just comments you'd like to make, please feel free to just raise them. I feel like I'm at an auction. I want to say going. And gone to the lucky winner of SABSA. And
lucky me. Lucky me. Thanks very much, Helena and Sean and Marla. You know, the critical factor of running these workshops, really, we ran the first one in 2021. And obviously we had a gap last year with COVID, and there were a range of things that happened. But I was just chatting with Marla, and you know, there's thousands of supervisors in our industry, and I know that another colleague of mine has just WhatsApped me here today to say that some people graduated last year and they are already supervising students and they haven't got any experience. So what we were trying to do with this workshop that we are running at the moment is to just give an insight into the experiences from Helena, Sean, Noel, the whole team of people that have actually been here. So I'm not quite sure of the level of experience of the people on the call here. I know obviously Letitia and Charlene, and there's a bunch of people here, Marlene, that are very experienced supervisors, but it's really creating the link. And Sean, you mentioned mentorship. Helena, you've done these workshops for people at Gibbs, you know, one-on-one or small group workshops with people. So I guess just from SABSA side, we're trying to offer a service to everybody, whether you take it up or you don't, that's up to you, but that's also part of the research database, or not the research supervision and external examiners database, because we do know that some institutions are in earlier stages of development than others. And how do you find people to supervise if you don't know who they are? So that is what we're trying to do on our side. So it's not really a comment on supervision per se, or with your students. But I guess, from a while ago when the standards were written, I remember something about articulating through the professional masters into the doctoral or the PhD right in the beginning. And it was at the beginning of the journey that you both touched on, that people need to understand what they're studying at the master's level before they actually articulate. Is that right? Am I not right? Where are we taking it? Just a comment. Thanks.
And then connected to what Anne said, Obi, I'll be with you in a moment. It's also that Anne and I were discussing, I mean, you know, a lot of people say they are supervisors, but, and please, I'm interested to hear people like you, Prof Barnard and Gossel, and many others who've supervised for a long time at the doctoral and PhD levels. My understanding has always been that in order for someone to say that it's towards their research sort of development, it does not count the postgraduate diploma honors supervision. I'm seeing more and more people say that they are supervisors, and that's what I was just commenting to Anne, who are supervising, for example, research reports at a postgraduate or a level 8. And for me, it's only from 9 and 10 that people are technically classified as supervisors. I do see Prof Gossel nodding your head. I'm not sure anyone else, your thoughts around this, because obviously I'm well aware that at Publix there's different things. Prof Cooper, I see you also agreeing. So I do think that's quite important, and when we establish the supervisor space, that we are looking specifically at masters and doctoral supervision or PhD supervision, because as I said, more and more people are putting themselves forward as supervisors. When we start probing, it is very much at the level 8, which is a very different requirement.
Thanks, Marla. I do know that the council, the CHE, are also going to be starting to investigate the different institutions and levels of supervision. So it's just really as a way of SABSA trying to be ahead of the curve of what people are going to be asking for, to have prepared some of our supervisors by showcasing your experience in the levels here. So when there's been quite a few questions about the database that we're creating, it is going to be linked to the website. It will be password protected. We're going to be linking it to your ORCID profiles, ResearchGate, LinkedIn. So it will be up to each person linking to do their own research on who they contract with. So that will be completely independent. It's just really giving this a matching kind of environment where everybody can search and seek. And by agreeing to be on the database, obviously you have agreed to sharing of your information, etc. I was recently in Spain at the AMBER conference, and I've made quite a few connections there at the International Business Schools, University of Birmingham, ESSEC in France, etc. And they're all keen to get on board with the supervisor database. So I think it's quite exciting. But we do have to, as you've said, Marla, make sure that the quality is correct, and not the quality, but that the supervisors are experienced at the level that they need to be. And obviously I'm guided by...
More transparent about it.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's why it will be linked to your own profiles of research, etc., and the levels that you are willing to supervise or able to supervise at. So I think that will just help ease the pain for quite a few of the schools in developing stages. I don't know, HB, do you want to comment on any of that? We've done quite a few chats about that.
I fully agree. I just commented in the chat, I think in the early days, one gained experience by co-supervising. And I also think, to the point being raised, one can never get enough experience. So even if you want to be independent, if you're comfortable in the subject area and the methodology, I always find, colloquiums and proposal defenses and, examiner reports very insightful, and you almost learn by that. What we spoke about, Avinci, at length is our supervisors are saying to us, share some of the examiner reports, what are the insights, because that's the easiest way to learn. And, even as an experienced supervisor, I and many others can testify, it's a constant learning curve. You learn new things all day. So also be open to be mentored to other and to test and bounce ideas, and I think this is great for a forum like this, very rich of knowledge, little tricks of the trade that can just keep sharpening the knives and the pencils the whole time.
So I think, thanks for that, Javier. And is there anything further you wanted to close off or comment? I do see a couple of people have said they have to jump into evening discussions, etc. And obviously, if there's any further questions, please do pop them in the chat. If there aren't, you'll see that a poll has just popped up for feedback for day 2. Those of you that are on, please could we ask that you answer the 2 questions and then submit so that we can get feedback. Apologies. It is all anonymous. So if you can just pop in those 2 answers, and then Anne will receive the anonymous responses to that.
You can see it's very
so I'll just give everyone a few minutes for that.
Very detailed. We're just trying to see if we're hitting the mark with what everybody is needing. A bit like nursery school. This is definitely not a PhD thesis. Sorry about that.
I think it's important that people do have that. But I do want to say once again, and I firstly want to say with regards to, from your side, the way you drive this sort of thing, I think it is critical. I mean, we speak about the CHE, we know that the quality assurance framework that is going to impact in 2024, public and private higher education institution is focused on the 15 higher education practice standards. If you look at some of those practice standards, supervision, research, processes, and data-driven value are huge on the agenda. Those of us at business schools that are looking towards accreditations, regardless of which ones, again, back to what are your processes in place? How are you getting this done? What are your stats? What are you doing with the research? So I think regardless of where we position ourselves as business schools, all of this remains critical and important, and in a self-directed journey as well. So thank you that you are continually flying the SABSA flag for us. as well as the fact that you continue to keep the overseas and the global markets, the African markets, and the local markets open to us. I think you can see from the feedback, and I can share the poll, we have 96% of people that felt that it certainly, they did learn a lot, it did meet their expectations. No one thinks it didn't, or they didn't learn anything. Some people wanted a little bit more detail in both days, day 1 and day 2, which I think is always important, because for some people, there are certain things they'd like a little bit more detail about. So I think really great in terms of the responses thus far as well. So I think it's important to also note that for the majority of people, this did certainly hit the mark. So thank you to you, Anne. Then to both Prof Barnard and Prof Gossel, thank you for your insights. I think that you've given us a wealth of information, and I really do think knowledge dissemination and co-creating is the way that people do learn. And the fact that you shared of your knowledge just so freely and so openly was really incredible. Some people like to hold back, and the two of you truly, yes, huge round of applause. The two of you truly did not hold back. So for your free flowing of ideas and your sharing and your ability to help, thank you to both of you. I hope you have a restful weekend. I see Anne is polling us again. So Anne, perhaps we can send that out, to the wider database as well. For those of you still on, please feel free to answer these questions so that Anne can see that. And I see everyone is saying thank you to the speakers, etc., and saying these sessions are brilliant and very much appreciated, Anne and team. So thank you, and I hope you have a good evening. We will stay on, so for those of you who are doing the polls, and tomorrow there will be session 3. We're going into tomorrow, same time, same place, so to speak, but certainly different speakers and different topics. So, Anne, do you want me to, or do you want to introduce a little bit about tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow we're focusing on the doctoral supervision. So I know that's going to be a very exciting discussion. I think that a lot of people have been anticipating that. So the last 2 days we focus on masters. HB, do you want to say anything about the doctoral stuff tomorrow, the doctoral program?
So I know HB is not doing tomorrow. Do you want to comment around the 2 tomorrow, or do you, the research paradigms?
So tomorrow I think it's basically to the earlier point of that sliding scale of Helena, that I think it's very valuable going into the research paradigms, because we need to see how the students are anchored, talking about the epistemology, ontology, axiologies, and those terminology that are very daunting to a lot of colleagues, and we start around that, which will anchor that. And I think at the doctoral level, it's extremely important, and you will find that it's a very useful topic, good feedback. And then the second one will go into the examination process and requirements, and I think that's also valuable. So without repeating the topics, we'll almost look at the discussion from the other side. And then on Thursday, we have the thesis methodology and design, and I will say a little bit more about that, but, almost anchor it, giving the different perspectives, and then right at the end, the different roles and methods for supervision, and, how one should engage, and almost wrap it up. And that's where we started yesterday morning. So that's a quick highlight, colleagues.
Perfect. And I think also, Charlene, you're on the call. You're going to be presenting tomorrow. So I don't know, we're very much looking forward to Charlene. Do you want to put your camera on, Charlene, and introduce yourself and do a little pitch for your presentation? See if she can find a camera.
Not really, Anne.
Okay, that's all good.
But thank you for asking.
All right. Okay, I'm going to close down the poll. Let's just see if there's anything there. I'm going to just share the results quickly, and then we can, I'm going to have to do some homework on that with a few details. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Yes. And it didn't, there weren't really answers.
Oh, they weren't. Okay, they're numbers. I can see it in the back end, but I'll put that up. There's like not very many answers there. I think
it's yeah. So I think there's not a lot of answers. That's why.
Okay, that's fine. All right. Well, I don't want to waste time here. We look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. And again, thank you to everybody for attending. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Much
Bye.
appreciated.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.